All right. Hello, everybody. This is Omar Lyles, the mental health coach, and we are going to have a wonderful conversation tonight. And I hope that each and every single one of you will actually be able to enjoy this conversation. And it's a conversation that needs to be had, especially when it comes down to dealing with pastors and not only just pastors, but clergy in of itself. So tonight we're going to be talking about clergy burnout, caring for our shepherd, understanding and coping with burnout with Pastor Thomas Frederick. Frederick. Is that how I
That's right.
pronounce it?
That's right. That's right.
All
Thanks,
right.
Omar.
So right now, yeah, how you
Well,
doing?
I just
All
wanted.
right.
Yeah,
So
I'm doing well. I'm doing well.
oh, okay, all right. So, first of all, before we actually start, I would like to have you actually introduce yourself.
Sure, sure, sure. So, of course, my name's Tom Frederick. I am a professor of psychology, and I am also the online curriculum coordinator for a counseling degree at California Baptist University. And so most of my work is kind of in that counseling field. I'm a licensed therapist in my state, but most of my time is spent in the academic realm. I am a church leader, but I'm not currently a pastor, although I am an MK. Oh, no, no, no. I'm a PK. I'm a PK. So my
Oh,
dad was a
okay.
pastor.
I am too.
Oh, all right, all right. So you
Yeah,
understand,
yeah,
and
I was a
so
PK too.
ooh, the best of times and the opposite of that sometimes too, right? And so basically, my work transitioned from general research and kind of counseling to really focusing on clergy burnout and how that process works. And so I'm sure as we conversate later, we'll talk more about how that evolved. But that's kind of the stuff that I do now. We do some empirical work like journal articles, research in the social sciences. And then in 2024, we actually wrote the book Caring for Our Shepherds, Understanding and Coping with Burnout as a Pastor.
Mm, awesome, awesome.
Yeah.
There are going to be a number of questions. We're not going to take a whole lot of time, but basically just discussing this book and about you and everything like that.
Right.
So, who came up with the title of the book, and how did you go about just writing the book? Who came
Sure.
up with the title?
So my memory is that I came up with the title,
Okay.
and so like one of the best things like I would recommend Omar in terms of kind of productivity is to like come up with collaborative teams and networks of people that you work well with, and I was blessed in when I came on at CPU. I came in with a really strong person. His name is Scott Dunbar. He was one of the co-authors of the book, and he and I very quickly became friends, and we started to collaborate and do these other kinds of research projects, which are fascinating, like doing a survey, figuring out kind of psychological variables, things like that. And then one day, it must have been in 2017, Scott and I had been working on burnout, especially related to faculty members and online faculty members. And Yvonne came into my office and she said, "Tom, I need your help. We need to do something." And I said, "Well, what do you need, Yvonne?" She was an esteemed colleague. She was at CPU before me. Well, here, her pastor at that time had committed suicide in his church office because of the burnout and the strain and some of the other mental health concerns that he was carrying. And it was an act of God that Yvonne was supposed to go into the church that day to have a ladies' Bible study, and she would have been right next to the pastor when he actually did
Mm,
the act. She could have been one of the ones to find the body, but that day the ladies' Bible study decided to go off campus for the Bible study. And so she found out about it, of course, heartbroken and just distraught. And so she said, "We have to do something. Can we turn our burnout research into something beneficial for the kingdom to help pastors that are so important?" And I said, "Absolutely." So back then we just started to write. some theoretical things, and then we started to do some more research, traditional research projects, and then ultimately it culminated in this book, Caring for Our Shepherds.
Mm, mm. Awesome, awesome. Uh, and I know that the book is dealing with burnout and things of that nature, but did the other two authors, was it their intention to write about this book as well, or did they have like the same experiences? I know that they're not here.
Yeah, so each of us has different kind of components to this kind of team, which culminated in this work and especially in this book. I would say Yvonne is the heart of it. She's passionate and engaged, and she really does a lot of our kind of encouragement and kind of those things to kind of help us to keep going. She's motivating us, that kind of a thing. Scott's role, he's a business professor. And so he does a lot of, like in the book, you'll read a lot about some of the work and organizational pieces that sort of apply to the church. And so he does that part because he knows the organizational structures, kind of the business practices and human resource pieces therein, mainly from a hospital perspective. But he's been able to translate some of those over. And my role was
Mm,
much more of the theological piece, much more of the kind of development, kind of research piece. And so the three of us, since collaborating, like I said, it's about 2017, 2018, initially where there was a lot of, well, not a lot of, but there were negotiations about who's going to do what. But now we're like a well-oiled machine, and I'll do something, and then Yvonne will say, hey, no, da, 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 or Scott will come in, or Yvonne will start, and then we'll begin. So it's really organic at this point, and it's very beautiful. And I know this isn't kind of part of the conversation, but
mm,
these networking teams that work well are amazing. Like I can't. It helps to stave off some of the burnout things, kind of the stressors related to work. It, usually for me, like I get too used to things that I'm writing, and then I miss really easy typos where I'll be like, oh, that sentence is perfect. I'll be writing my thing, and I'm
mhm,
like, that
mhm.
sentence is
Yeah,
perfect, and then I'll
I
show
do that.
it.
Mhm,
And then Yvonne will be like, what are you talking about?
mhm.
Or Scott will be like, what does that even mean? And I'm like, what do you mean? That's perfectly obvious to anybody. No, no, no. So it helps me get out of my own head.
Mm, mm, okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So sometimes the professor and you start to think about these kinds of things and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So how
almost.
long did it take you to write this book?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say overall, probably a year, I would say.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
yeah. And so like up till this book's part, we had been doing very academic things. And so, in many ways, this book was much more challenging to write because we're used to writing for a peer review process. So, like
Mm,
for the academic piece, you
yeah,
write a paper and then you send it out, and then three people
yeah,
review it and give you feedback. And which means that there's a level of, I guess, rigor or whatever, right? It's a
yeah,
different
yeah.
process, and
Mhm,
we're very used to that. And so when we got to this caring for our shepherds, it was different. We had to slow things down. We had to really work
yeah.
on working on emphasizing communication, that kind of thing,
Mhm,
because the intent of caring for our shepherds, there are two audiences we have in mind here. One are pastors, and so I'm hoping that the pastor would pick this book up, be able to read it in a couple hours and get some really good nuggets without having to expend too much mental energy to process the information, like, make it more understandable and accessible. The second audience is for interested church leaders. I'm thinking deacons, elder board folks, like however your church is organized, this book would be good for them.
mm,
They can get an understanding, hey, my pastor might be experiencing this, or maybe we ought to ask these questions, or maybe we could even set up some HR processes to encourage things
yeah,
like sabbaticals or counseling services or whatever, right? Whatever that looks like in that church. But we're hoping that would happen. And then also, if a lay person wanted to pick this up because they, love their pastor and they wanted to read it and want to kind of understand some of the stressors or maybe even some support for the pastor. So
Mm.
those are kind of the groups that we had in mind for this book. Definitely not an academic audience aimed at a book aimed at an academic audience.
Yeah, and you know what? The kind of audience that I write for are for everyday lay people.
Oh,
You
okay.
know, I'm not considered like a, I would say like an advanced scholar in that sense. Like for example, like when you're writing a bunch of periodical articles and it goes out to a lot of colleges and universities, and you're waiting for them, for their approval, and and they put their thumbs up, and it goes and lands in some newspaper. And I don't. I'm not in that circle.
Mm, mm,
So I'm more practical in my approach because I'm a practical person.
right.
Most of the posts in the academic world mostly write stuff for the academic world. And so I'm more of a practical person. And that's why I like this particular book. So everybody, okay, everyone who's watching needs to get this book, Caring for Our Shepherd, Understanding and Coping with Burnout as a Pastor. I've been checking out some readings myself. So I want to ask you this question. Can you describe the impact of emotional labor and drain uh, the self of a pastor?
Yeah, so that was one of the most fascinating parts of this whole process. So we were we have colleagues in Christian ministry, and so we were talking to them, and we were like, "Hey, so like, did you ever have this experience? Right, you just finished a sermon; it's the end of the service, and you're outside, greeting the people as they're coming through, or maybe it's you're in line at the potluck or whatever, and a well-meaning parishioner comes up to you and they're like, pastor, I loved your sermon, but dot
Mm,
dot, right? That but is a signal that something's coming, that's probably disapproval or frustration or some kind of in a positive sense, but we could say constructive criticism, right? But you've put your time and effort and heart into this message. The message is intended for God's people in this place, this time,
mm,
and you hear this, right? So the emotional labor piece is, how do you respond to that person in that moment in a
mm,
pastoral manner, right? Do you, because like it could make you disappointed, dejected, angry, right? So do you lash out at Saint Mary, who's been a part of the church for 80 years, and she was alive longer than you could spell the word pastor. And so
mm,
it's like, what do you do? Right. So the emotional labor in terms of surface acting means that we set aside our experience of that moment and we engage with that person in a pastoral sense in this way. Thanks for the feedback, Mary. I appreciate that. Maybe we could talk about your concerns later. Maybe we could, right? And as opposed to, oh my gosh, you break into tears and because it's devastating, or you're like, you know what? Why don't you spend 80 hours this next week breaking a circuit? Right? So both of those responses aren't appropriate in that moment. So the surface, but the surface acting means that we set aside our experience and we engage. And our friends in ministry, when we told them about emotional labor in that sense, they both, all of them stopped and they were like, wow, that explains so much, because it's a tool psychologically. Because I have to put aside my experience, and it eventually it kind of denies or minimizes, it empties my emotional experience, my emotional self in that moment. And it's not a one-off. Pastoral ministry is oftentimes these kinds of things, right?
mm,
And that's difficult. And then so that's one aspect of the emotional labor. And in the literature, surface acting emotional labor has been tied to burnout in lots and lots of public or social facing jobs. Things as regular as retail at your local Macy's or Nordstrom's or J.C. Penney or Target or Walmart, to pastors, to psychotherapists of different kinds, to all kinds of any job that's facing with human interaction. This is part of it. Of being a waitress or a server at a restaurant. Deep acting, on the other hand, which is another component of emotional labor, means that the person tries to empathize, to understand what the experience of that other person is, and then use that to engage with them. Now, so deep acting is much more of a tool that a pastor would use for pastoral counseling, discipleship focused things, maybe in a small group ministry where I'm trying to understand you and what's going on with you, and then using that as it touches me to empathize with your experience. So it's much more of an, an attempt to be authentic in that moment. And of course, that takes a lot of energy too, but that's much more of a focused kind of aspect of emotional labor. And so the literature on emotional labor is kind of mixed. And we actually found the same thing in a recent study that we did looking at emotional labor for surface acting, very much related to negative aspects of ministry, like lower ministerial satisfaction and lower and an increased intent to turn over. I'm thinking about leaving my ministry more now. And the deep acting components were much they weren't as strongly tied or tied in the right ways that we were expecting with those kinds of variables that we were looking at. But it's powerful, right, to think about, how am I there for my congregation, and what do I do with myself? And emotional labor talks about the cost of those things for pastors, and it's important.
Yeah. Do you ever think about, apart from, the book and everything like that, how do you think pastors should go about, um, as far as like burnout, what can they do to absolve themselves from just being so involved with everything that they do, especially anything that's church related?
Sure, sure, sure. I mean, so I think there's two levels to this, maybe three levels to this. The first level I would want to talk about is the congregation, the congregational level. So I think it's helpful for the pastor to set expectations about obligations. When am I supposed to be here? Now, of course, if there were emergencies, that kind of stuff, right? That makes sense. But I also know, like when I was a kid, my dad was expected to be at every church event, even if it wasn't necessarily tied to his formal ministry or preaching or something. And so, is that reasonable? Like 4 or 5 days a week, whatever's going on, do, should the pastor be there? I don't. It's something to consider, right? What are the reasonable obligations? How do you handle emergencies? That kind of thing. So I recommend pastors having more formal conversations with their congregations and with whatever polity piece to that, whether it's a hiring committee, whether it's the church council, whatever your church does, right? I don't know, but I'd have those conversations. Those conversations also need to be had with the family, because the pastor and family are unique among any
Mm,
career because
mhm,
of the embedded nature of the family and the congregation. Right? I'm a therapist. I'm a professor. I get to go home. Right? If a
mhm,
student calls me, I can look at the phone and decide, do I want to pick up? Do I want not to? Right? But as a pastor, I'm living with the congregation. My kids are going to Sunday school with someone I might be counseling in my office.
mhm.
All kinds of dual and triple and quadruple types of relationships. And that's the way that the Lord set this up. This isn't a bad thing. This is life and community, right? The shepherd should smell like the sheep, to use
Mm,
a metaphor from a book called Elders. But I also think the kids need to understand, the spouse needs to understand, there might be times when I need to say no to you because I need to do these church obligations, and vice versa, right? The church needs to know, if it's graduation, I'm going to put my phone on silent and I'm going to be there for my 18-year-old in high school, right? That kind of stuff. And so there needs to be a mutual kind of conversation and setting of expectations. I would also recommend, if possible, and if it's within your church's polity, an elder, plural elder board would be helpful, because instead of one pastor elder person, there's multiple, and so the emotional draw is uh, spread across multiple people as opposed to one,
Yeah.
and that
Are you
helps.
talking
Right?
about, yeah, are
I'm
you
sorry.
speaking in terms of like having like what an assistant pastor or like executive pastor or getting your other ministers involved with, just the average duties, the various duties that he or she can appoint at the church.
Absolutely. And then so that kind of a thing. So like so for example, if it's a senior pastor and an assistant or associate, then the two of them, or if they're multiple, they can arrange their schedules much like a therapist. Like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, so this weekend's really important. You be on call because
Mhm.
my kids at a soccer tournament, or my kids or whatever, right? That kind of a thing, as opposed to a single pastor model. And I know a lot of churches are there. That's a lot of pressure on that person, and it's a lot harder to step away from certain kind of obligations that way. So I would recommend that. I also know some churches have lay elders and a pastor,
Yeah.
and so
Mhm.
that would also work. You could have where the elders aren't like where they're actually ministering alongside, not kind of supervision oversight stuff, where the
Mhm.
elders would be preaching, doing a little counseling, that kind of of an approach. And the same thing would happen. So Pastor Jones is maybe on vacation. Oh, maybe this is an important family event for him. So for the next 3 days, call elder, call elder Bob, or call elder, Smith or whatever. And you can arrange those kinds of things. And it really helps, I think, kind of diffuse is what I would talk about, the emotional um, needs and demands placed from the congregation onto the life of the pastor. So those are the community things. In
Mhm.
terms of the person or self of the pastor, Christian spiritual practices we have found to be key.
Mhm.
So there are like three levels of Christian spiritual practices. There are immediate kind of short-term ones.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of like the Jesus prayer, where when Sister Smith comes up to give you feedback on your sermon again, instead of clobbering her because you've had a tough week, you
Mhm.
can just slow down for 3 seconds, say the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. Get your
Mhm.
breathing on under control, slow things down, and then respond. And so
Mhm.
that space helps us to develop kind of time to respond appropriately to the sister, and set aside our own kind of frustrations,
Mhm.
right? So those short-term practices, and we
Mhm.
need those because pastors, like all people, have bad days and bad weeks and bad
Yeah.
months,
Yeah. Yes.
right?
I
And
believe so. Mhm.
yeah, and so it's
Yeah.
like, okay, we slow that moment down. And then I would talk about adding some practices to daily devotional activities, things like Lectio Divina, where I'm um, focusing, slowing things down, and then meditating on a short passage of scripture to kind of take it in to our hearts and our minds, where it becomes kind of this thing that's always in our thoughts as we're going over the day and over the minutes when I'm standing in line picking up prescriptions, or when I'm talking to a parishioner or whatever, that kind of stuff. So I'm meditating on the scripture. That would begin every morning when I'm doing my Bible reading. Not necessarily Bible reading for quantity. I'm picking this passage and I'm staying there for a week, meditating, memorizing. Yeah, some people talk about it as chewing and swallowing. Right? I'm just taking this thing in and savoring the Word of God in and savoring it.
Mhm.
And then the most long term practice would be things that are more kind of like centering prayer, where I'm sitting and more moments of silence, reflecting on God and His Word, and trying to find God in those inner spaces of chaos in my life. Where do I see God in my thoughts? And
Mhm.
in the bad thoughts that I have, take them to God in those quiet spaces, and have Him work on them, can change me from the inside out. But all three types of practices are really crucial, because the more of those that you do, the more inner space you have to respond appropriately in those day-to-day mundane tasks. You have more spiritual resources to engage with other people in your congregation.
And that's why I think what's also important is that because we talked about the other elements of adding, associate pastors and elders and stuff like that to get involved, but also to identify people in your congregation who are licensed clinical social workers, who are licensed professional counselors and therapists, so that if they needed that help, they could be pointed right back to them. And so that sort of takes a lot of the work away from the pastor as well.
Right.
So that's a very good thing too. So I have a few more questions, and let me see. Here we go. Can you tell us about the various kinds of mindfulness approaches to managing burnout in the pastor? We already talked about it just a little bit,
Right.
when you talk about like the three levels and things like that. But can you continue talking about that?
Sure. So I would make a couple of really important distinctions. So there's like mindfulness is super popular right now in the
Yes, yes, I
psychotherapy
noticed that.
literature. Yeah, right. And so the as a
Yeah,
so for
yeah,
some Christian,
especially in the coaching field, a lot of life coaches are into a lot of mindfulness.
right. And so if we define mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way, and so what that usually means is we're trying to increase our awareness of what's happening in
Mm,
our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds, and also in our environment. And as we're doing that, we want to kind of approach ourselves in a more compassionate manner. So that is, yeah, we all have negative self-talk, like that voice that's going on in your head. Sometimes it's very critical or negative, especially if we're having a bad day, if we're hungry or tired, maybe we binge too much Netflix or something, we're not our best selves. That voice can be very critical. So what mindfulness says is, okay, you're here, we want you to pay attention to that voice. It's triggered for a reason, it's happening for a reason, but recognize that that's not your totality. You aren't that voice, and
mm,
that voice might be lying. It's deceptive, it might not be truthful. So we want to hear
mm,
it, we want to kind of find out why, and then we want to kind of be compassionate with ourselves, and then move on in a more authentic manner, how you want to be as a person. Do that, and don't ignore the voice. See the voice, but don't don't pretend like that's who you are, or that's who
mhm,
you are at, right? So there are things that mindfulness people would suggest, like mindful walking, which is really a great exercise to do. If you're out walking around, or if any of our listeners are walking around, what I would recommend them to do is, okay, of course, pay attention to where you're walking, right? We don't want any accidents. But have you ever noticed how it actually feels when your feet hit the ground? What's that like? What's the actual impact? How heavy your shoes are? What do the clothes feel like in your on your body? Can you discern and touch the various, like, can you feel the different muscles that are needing to work in that moment? And so you really focus your attention on your body and what it's doing in that space. So that's paying attention on purpose to your physical experience. So mindful walking. Another practice that's often talked about is called mindful eating. And so
mm,
you take a raisin. This is what, right? So you take one raisin right out of the little red box, pop it into your mouth, and what? Boom, 3 seconds, it's gone.
mm,
That's how usually I eat raisins, right?
yeah.
But mindful eating raisins is, you take this raisin and you begin by number one, trying to really feel what it's like between your fingers or in your palm.
Mm,
Take it up to your nose. What does it smell like? What is it? Do you get any sensations there? And touch it to your lips, and then even bite it, and then slowly chew. What is it like to feel in your mouth? Are there different sensations where it depends on where it's touching your tongue, that kind of thing? And so you take all this time So when you swallow it, what does that feel like? Can you feel it going down your throat? That kind of stuff. And so mindful eating is another thing you do where you slow the process down and kind of try to be in each moment or aspect of that, as opposed to what most people do is it pop the raisin in their mouth. Dinner, right? We do that all the time at dinner. Okay, I've got 10 seconds. I'm going to shovel in as much as I can, and then I'm off on to the next thing. And so mindfulness is about slowing down, being in that moment, and paying attention to our experiences. Another component of mindfulness, another thing to think about is breathing. Can you,
Mm,
um, as you're thinking about the inhalation and exhalation of your breath, can you feel the wind go through your nostrils and into your lungs, through your mouth? What does it feel like when your lungs are expanding, when they're shrinking? So, all of those kind of somatic, physiological, or bodily experiences we can pay attention to. So
mm,
that's regular mindfulness.
mm,
Christian mindfulness is paying attention to how God is working in our experiences in those moments.
mhm,
Right? So
mm,
how can we experience God in gratitude while we're eating and celebrating and receiving the bounty that the Lord's provided for us? How can we, when we're breathing, especially, right? We can think about the in the New Testament and the Old Testament, the Hebrew and the Greek words for breath are also words for spirit. So in a sense, when I'm breathing in, breathing in the Spirit of God. So what
mhm,
is that like, and how
mm,
do I take that spirit in and have it enlive in my life in those moments? We would focus on those kinds of things. Spiritual journaling is also a very helpful practice, kind of traditional journaling exercises, those kinds of things. There's an Ignatian spiritual practice that's really connected, I think, with mindfulness, with Christian mindfulness, and that's the examine. And so basically what the examine is every twice a day, we take a moment, we slow our breathing down, and then we ask ourselves, in the past 12 hours, the past day, where have we seen God working most clearly in our lives? What was happening there? What was going on? What was God doing? What kind of messages was God sending to me? Where do I see God?
mhm,
The other part is that, where did I feel more distant from God in those spaces? What was happening? Where
mm,
was I? And we track those over the course of a week, a month, a lifetime, and the patterns that emerge are
mm,
amazing. Things that we need to do more, right? We want to pay closer attention to where God's working in our lives. Those are important things. And then, in my experience, the things that when God's most distant are usually when I'm like hungry, tired, that kind of stuff. So there are physical pieces to that, but then also when I'm dealing with temptations in my life, in my own spiritual life. And so both of those are really important information to have, so I know what to do and know what battles I need to fight in terms of
mm.
taking the word in and kind of mustering a defense against the wiles of the devil, so to speak.
Okay, awesome, awesome, awesome. So I have like two more questions, and then I'm going to have you just let everybody. No, I'm gonna go with the two questions
Yeah,
first, last.
sure.
Okay. What are the types of relations between work and family life?
That's a great question. So the literature talks about three general aspects of the relationship between work and family. One is conflict, and right, if the boss wants me in my office at 5 p.m., but my kid's got a piano recital at 5 p.m., unless I can teleport or clone myself, I can't be in two places at the same time,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
And or emotional demands, right? I've got this project at work and it's taking an effect on me, and I can't be with my family emotionally, or that kind of stuff, right? So there's conflict. There's another perspective that would say that there's an enriching effect.
Mm,
And so one of the main ways this happens is from the family to the workplace. So in the family, older children might learn how to do leadership activities. They might share a little bit more responsibility in helping their younger siblings to get dressed, that kind of thing. And those patterns and behaviors, they can translate into the workplace very seamlessly. The level of conflict resolution that spouses go through on a daily basis, that's directly translatable to the workplace. Or there's always kind of negotiation and collaboration that's happening. So there's this enriching effect, and then vice versa. There might be some benefits, enriching activities from workplace to the home, maybe in terms of time management, other budgeting, whatever, that kind of stuff, right? So there's this enriching effect. The last one is called balance.
Mm.
And balance is the idea where there's some kind of equality between the family and the workplace, that kind of a thing. And so with the work family balance component, it's important to think about what makes the balance. Because it might not be time, like physical presence. I might have more physical presence with one or the other. There might be demands. One might be more demanding than the other, but that
Mm.
person needs to kind of think about what would be satisfactory in that relationship between work and family, to come up with some kind of personal level of balance, things that are satisfactory or satisfactory for that person in that moment.
Mhm.
So those are the three main aspects. The challenge is, though, as we were talking about earlier, that doesn't translate necessarily to the pastor's family, simply because the pastor's family and the congregation are, in a sense, in this big mass of social group together, right? Because the pastor's family goes to that church and is there at the church and works at the church, and the children are going to Sunday school, right? The whole thing's very different. And so there's what we would talk about is a high level of boundary ambiguity between the pastor's family and the
Mm.
congregation, because it's not a clear, distinct separation between the two.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know what? I love, pretty much the questions that I was coming forth, and I also like the questions that you pretty much have answered. And I hope that everyone in the audience that have tuned in could take some of this in, because I really want people to actually get your book. You can
Mm.
let everybody know where they can actually find your book, and who are the other authors on the book, before we go. Matter of fact, actually right now.
Okay. Okay.
You can let everybody know where they can actually find. Also, let everybody know how they can actually get in contact with you. Do you have any social media handles that you would like to have everybody let you know? Let them know, where you're at, really.
Sure, sure, sure. So so our book, caring for our shepherds, and here's what it looks like. Of course, it's available on Amazon, and then also through the publisher Cascade. So if you type in "Caring for Our Shepherds," Cascade Books, like Google or whatever search engine you use, then it should pop right up, and then you should be able to find it. So my colleagues and I, Yvonne and Scott and I, have started a website that has lots of resources and some of the other journal articles we've written. And that website is called Center for Pastoral Renewal. And there's also a
Mhm.
link there for an email that we check. So you can find me there. I have a Twitter, I'm sorry, an X feed or whatever. I don't know what it's called anymore. It's always going to be Twitter to me. So I have a Twitter handle, and it's TV Frederick 712. And so at Frederick 712, you can find me, or type in my name, Tom Frederick, and
Mhm.
I'm there. And just reach out. Anything any questions you have, feel free to go to those sites. That way, Yvonne and Scott are available through the Center for Pastoral Renewal, and so it's really a great opportunity. I really appreciate you, Omar, allowing me to come and have this conversation with you. It's been a great time.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No problem. No. Wonderful. Wonderful. So, everyone, you have the information. I'm glad. I'm very, very glad that you have come on tonight for this podcast. And a lot of times I always invite people to come on, this particular podcast because it relates anything that deals with trauma, stress, mental health, burnout, all these subjects, falls um, under mental health. So I definitely appreciate you accepting the invite to actually come on. So everyone, thank you for watching us tonight on Over Allows the Mental Health Coach. If you want to find out where we are, you can just go to my page, our Facebook page, Omar Allows the Mental Health Coach, where I'm interviewing authors. I'm interviewing licensed professional counselors, social workers, chaplains, and also healthcare professionals, which I'm going to have a lot of them on in the future as well. And we're also on YouTube, which you'll see Omar Lyles Talks
Mm.
Mental Health. So before I go, I would like you to here's a book that me and a former colleague of well, she's still a colleague of mine. Her name is Dr. Francesca Sampson. It's called "Will You Still Love
Oh
Me?"
wow.
All right, and this is mental health and relationships. All right, because there's a lot of that going on uh, when it comes down to relationship. People's mental health needs to be
Right.
checked because you're going through a lot of this is for a lot of people who are going through a lot of issues and things of that nature, and they need some sort of repair. So this book is self-explanatory, very easy to read, and also this particular book is called Becoming a Listening
Mm.
Ear. All right, relationships, family, and friends. All right, you just having a listening ear for those who are in need of someone to actually talk to. Okay, so those are those particular books, and I also thank you for actually coming on tonight, and I definitely would like to invite you on to get it in the
It'd
future.
be our
Okay,
pleasure. We'd love that. That'd be great.
no problem. All right, and God bless you, and we'll see each other. We'll talk
We
again.
yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Nice to see you. Nice to meet you.
All right.
Bye bye.
Okay. All right. God bless you.
You too.